right, so here are some quick notes. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but here are some quick notes to walk you through today's lesson, just to kind of make it a little bit easier. So last class, you should have written, I know I wasn't there, but you should have written your preliminary thesis and mapped out your body paragraphs. So your thesis and then body paragraph A is going to be about this, body paragraph B is going to be about this, and body paragraph C is going to be about this. So today we're going to build your first body paragraph. So you're going to choose one of your body paragraphs and you're going to write your observation. Remember, we talked about observations a couple of days ago. We said it's your topic sentence. It's your first sentence of your paragraph, and it should be an argument, and it should be based on your thesis. So if your thesis says something like, when confronted with fear, humans often act on their primal impulses rather than rational thought, therefore affecting their actions, survival, and values, then your first observation should look like this. When engaged in fear, particularly fear for survival, humans will do whatever they believe is necessary to survive, even if that is out of character for them. So I've tied that directly back into actions. It doesn't say the word actions. It could say actions. This one just doesn't, but it's tying it directly back into that, and it ties back to the thesis. So we're just narrowing the thesis in specifically on actions. So the observation is like super intense version, super like narrow version of the thesis, right? You're picking that one element and really tying into that. So go ahead, and if you have not already written that first observation, then pause the video and write that first observation. If you haven't even written your thesis yet, then you need to pause and go out and write your thesis and then come back. So either write your thesis or write your observation. And then if you've done that, then join me in the next step. So these are day 2 OEA notes. With quotations is the first bit that we're looking at here. So the first part of the E, or the evidence. So you want to make sure that you're selecting an appropriate quotation. Remember, E, it's supposed to be, it's evidence from the text. So it's a really good idea to use a direct quote. You don't have to, but oftentimes if you're not using a quote, people like to just summarize. And that's not what an analysis paper is. We're not looking for a summary. We're looking for support here. So, and for deeper thoughts. So it's a really good idea to use direct quotations from the text, but it can be really difficult to select a quotation that strongly supports your text. So here are some strategies. So you should be annotating or highlighting in your book when possible, or your notes, or if you're reading it on like a poem or something, you should be marking things up. That's why I told you to keep a reader's notebook, like write down quotes as you came across them when you were reading your books in the book tech, in the book club, in your digital notebook. You were supposed to be including quotes. So that was to help prepare you for this. So in the future as well, when you're reading something, so annotating and highlighting when you come across important quotes, or if a teacher highlights that quote specifically, drawing your attention there. If you've annotated well, then you should know exactly why a quote is important. You also want to keep track of important quotes if they're brought up in class discussions. We don't do a lot with this unit, but we did a couple. And you did group chats as well. So if there were quotes that came up there, it would have been a good idea to write them down. And then also just using your own judgment, or especially in this, we're talking about theme, so fear and survival. If a quote mentioned fear and survival, or it answered one of those essential questions, then you probably should have written it down. So if not, you might need to go back and do a little bit of rereading to find a really good quote. So think of it this way: you use, sorry, my cat sneezed. You use quotations to support your argument. So you're selecting, presenting, and discussing material from the text specifically to prove your point, to make your case. So it's very much the same way a lawyer brings evidence before a jury. You've made a case, whatever your argument is, you're trying to prove it. The quotes and the evidence from a text are just there to support it, right? To prove your point. So Remember, any quote you include in an OEA paper or paragraph has to strengthen your thesis or your observation. So ask yourself, does this quotation support and strengthen my thesis or observation? And the answer is yes, great, keep it. If the answer is no, find a better one. So let's practice. Let's say you're working with this observation, and this is from Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Elizabeth Lavenza is a dynamic character. And remember, a dynamic character is a character who grows and changes over the course of the work. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So which of the following three quotes would work best as evidence to support your observation? So this is the first one, spoken by Victor. Elizabeth was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition. She busied herself with following the aerial creations of the poets and the majestic, wondrous scenes which surrounded our Swiss home, sublime shapes of the mountains, the changes of the seas, seasons, tempest and calm, the silence of winter, and the life and turbulence of our alpine summers. She found ample scope for admiration and delight. This is the first one. So remember, we're looking for a quote that shows that Elizabeth was a dynamic character. So does this show that Elizabeth was a dynamic character, a character who changed? All right, here's the second one, spoken by Victor. In about a week after the arrival of Elizabeth's letter, we returned to Geneva. The sweet girl welcomed me with warm affection, yet tears were in her eyes as she beheld my emaciated frame and feverish cheeks. I saw a change in her also. She was thinner and had lost much of that heavenly vivacity that had before charmed me, but her gentleness and soft looks of compassion made her a more fit companion for one blasted and miserable as I was. So again, we're looking for the best quote to showcase that Elizabeth is a dynamic character, a character who grows and changes over the course of this story. All right, so this is option 2. Here's option 3. This is spoken by Elizabeth herself. When I reflect, my dear cousin, on the miserable death of Justine Moritz, I no longer see the world and its works as they before appeared to me. Before, I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I in books or heard from others as tales of ancient days or imaginary evils. At least they were remote and more familiar to reason than to the imagination. But now misery has come home, and men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. So which one of these three shows us that Elizabeth, her personality and her character has changed? Not just the way that she looks, but her actual personality has changed. And so I would say if you said this third one, then you would be correct. Because this is the one that is showcasing the most about how she sees herself and also how she sees the world and how that has changed. The first one just doesn't really talk about it at all. It's very pretty writing, but it doesn't really address this issue. The second one talks about the way that she's kind of looks and changed, but this one talks about how she sees the world as differently. So once you've chosen the perfect quote for your E of your paper to strengthen your O, you need to be able to gracefully incorporate it. It is not acceptable to just plop a quote down in your paper with little or no introduction. What I mean by that is you just write like observation, 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 and then quote, bleh, right? Like without telling me anything about it or who it's from or who it's by or what story it's from or context of the quote or anything like that. You can't just do that. You have to give context. So you have to introduce the quote. You have to give it context. You have to tell where it came from, who said it, and why it matters. This is especially important if you're doing something like a research paper or this paper where you're quoting from more than one source. For example, you might write something like this in your rough draft. Emperor penguins are by far the largest types of penguins. An average bird stands some 45 inches, 115 centimeters tall. Okay, this is plopping a quote in where it has a sentence and then the quote is its own sentence and it's just a quote, right? This is wrong. Don't do this. Okay, we weren't told where the quote came from. It could have been from anywhere from Kanye West to National Geographic. We don't know, right? And your reader's not going to know if they should trust your quote and therefore you, unless they can immediately see that it came from a reliable source. So instead, we want to try something like this. Emperor penguins are by far the largest type of penguins. National Geographic, one of the largest nonprofit scientific and educational institutions in the world, states an average bird stands some 45 inches, 115 centimeters tall. Okay, so you see how we have introduced this quote, we've named the source, and we explained the source. And that's helpful because even if you name a source, your reader might not always recognize it. So this helps the reader understand the importance of your source. So obviously, National Geographic is a bit larger of a source, so we understand that. But if you were to quote somebody that we didn't know, or maybe you know, but the average person doesn't, it's really helpful. For the context of our paper that we're writing, you don't necessarily have to include such background information like that, but you should tell me who the author is. You should tell me if it's like the genre, if it's a poem, different things like that should be included in your information here for your quote. Also, potentially context of what's going on in the story where that quote was happening. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So if you have questions, please ask, send a Schoology message or hold them till I come back. But it's really important to ask. So that leads us to the next step, which is we are going to look over that thesis, look over that observation that you already wrote, and now you're going to add the evidence to support that observation. So go ahead and pause me and go and write that evidence. And then when you're ready to add in the analysis portion, come back and hit play. All right, welcome back. We are into part 4, the final part, and this is the analysis. So what is it and how do I do it? So to analyze is to break something down into smaller parts and then examine how those parts work, both individually and together. So literary analysis involves examining all parts of a novel, play, short story, or poem, elements such as character, setting, tone, and imagery, and theme, and thinking about how the author uses those elements to create certain effects. So how do you do it? So simply put, analysis occurs when you explain how your E, your evidence, proves your O, your observation, and possibly why any of it matters anyway. So why do we care? So analysis, remember, should be the bulk of your OEA paper. Your O will be 1 to 2 sentences, your E should be 1 to 2 sentences, and then your A should be the rest of the paragraph, so like 4 to 6 sentences. So here's an example of an OEA paragraph broken down to, for you, and so you can see it, sorry. It's color-coded as well. So again, this is from Frankenstein. It's the exact same one that we were looking at earlier. So here's your O. In contrast to the static, permanently self-absorbed character of Victor, Mary Shelley writes Elizabeth Lavenza as a fully dynamic character. Here's your E, the evidence. The death of Justine Moritz changes Elizabeth from a naive, privileged young woman into someone who is both jaded and heartbroken. She explains this change in herself to Victor when she says, comma, quote, before I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard from others as tales of ancient days or imaginary evils. At least they were remote and more familiar to reason than to the imagination. But now misery has come home and men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. Shelley 2:13. Now we have our A. Now you'll notice here there is some words that have been crossed out. This is a really good phrase to use to start writing your analysis, but that you want to delete before you turn it in. So it's kind of like gets your brain going, but you don't want to include it in your actual paper. So this quote shows that you would erase it and just start with, Elizabeth has changed from the light-hearted, sweet-tempered teen that Shelley established earlier in the novel. Dishonesty and evil were once concepts that Elizabeth had only experienced in a second-hand way, chiefly through books, as she tells Victor, because of her privileged upbringing in the Frankenstein home. It is the bitter injustice of Justine's death that breaks Elizabeth and forces her to recognize that real evil does exist in the world alongside her. Shelley shows that Elizabeth is so far removed from her early innocent girlish self that spent her days singing and roaming the Swiss countryside that she now sees all of mankind as vicious and deeply evil. So you kind of can see how your O, your E and your A come together. The O is just giving us that observation, that argument, the thing that we're going to be talking about in this paragraph. Your E has some background information about what was happening in the story, and then it introduces the quote and has a quote that really showcases that O really well. And then the analysis, the A, is explaining it. It's just talking about the deeper meaning and kind of how Elizabeth changes and why. And so that's how they all kind of work together. So your task is to now write the analysis for your first OEA paragraph, the same one you've been working on this whole time. So you should have your O, your E, and now your A. And when you're finished, you're going to turn it into Schoology. It's going to count as a quiz grade, but I'm also going to be reading them and giving feedback on them. So it's a really good chance for you to get feedback before you turn in the full essay. So you can take the feedback from here and apply it to all of the OEA paragraphs going into this essay. So good luck. I hope this was helpful for you, and I will see you when I get back. All right, have a great rest of your day, and I can't wait to see your paragraphs or to read them.